Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today in this wonderful cyberspace space. My name is Dr. Niklas Novaki. I am a research officer at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, and it's a great pleasure for me to moderate this discussion today, which will focus on the implications of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic for Europe. Which was also the theme of the most recent issue of the Martens Center's European View Journal, which came out at the end of 2020. COVID-19, as all of us by now know, has been like as much of a black swan event as any, in the sense that few people saw it coming at the beginning of 2020. Even at the time, like when we received initial reports that something was happening in China and there was some kind of new virus strain developing. But since then, it's become clear that the consequences of the pandemic have been extremely dramatic for the world as a whole and for Europe in particular as well, across different policy areas. Most visibly, obviously, we've seen in the news that, and even in our own daily lives, that the coronavirus has caused very dramatic changes in Europe's economic and health policy, for example. We can think of the Next Generation EU recovery package that was agreed at the end of last year. We can think of the full or partial lockdowns that were implemented across Europe several times during the course of last year, which we still have in place to some extent, also here in Belgium, where I am based. And in addition to this, the virus has obviously affected also like other policy areas that perhaps are not in the news headlines as much as economic policy and health policy, such as foreign affairs, security and defense, and societal resilience. Vaccine diplomacy of China and Russia has become a major topic this year since China and Russia have begun to distribute their vaccines around the world and also in Europe's own neighborhood. There are also worries of decreasing defense budgets among European countries and in NATO in particular. We also have seen a spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories during the coronavirus pandemic, all of which kind of point out that the pandemic has acted in a way as a kind of threat multiplier, if one can say so. It has created a new set of problems for the European Union and the world to deal with, but it has also then accelerated and boosted some existing challenges and threats that Europe and the world have had to deal with. So given the broad systemic character of the pandemic and its implications, I think it's very important that Europe, Europeans and people around the world continue to reflect on the pandemic and what it has meant up until now. So for example, like what are the challenges that the EU and its member states still have to face and continue to face as we go further into this year? And what are the lessons that can be drawn from these challenges? So to discuss these and other questions today, we have an excellent lineup of speakers, all of whom also contributed to the autumn 2020 issue of the European View Journal. We have Konstantin Arvanitopoulos, Professor of International Politics and Karamanlis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and also a Senior Research Associate at the Martens Center. Welcome, Konstantin, and very good to see you again. We also have Pepin Bergsen, who is a research fellow at the Chatham House think tank in London. Welcome, Pepin. Also great that you were able to join us today. And then we also have Nadia Kovalchikova, who is a program manager and fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome to you as well, Nadia. So just a couple of house rules before we kick this discussion off. Each speaker will deliver short opening remarks. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session with the online audience, and all of you who are watching the live stream of this event can ask questions from the speakers by posting them on the event's Facebook page. So without further ado, I would first like to turn to Pepin to hear his thoughts on what are the kind of economic implications of the coronavirus for Europe, and what can we expect when going forward into 2021. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Yeah, so when looking at the economic and sort of the political economy impact of the pandemic on Europe, beyond sort of the direct economic implications, so the massive contractions in all European economies caused by the lockdowns imposed by governments, I think the most obvious change is one that you already touched upon, which is the Next Generation EU package. So, and that we now have a recovery fund on an EU level responding to a crisis is quite a big shift in the EU's economic governance framework. The EU's borrowing for the first time at scale, not just through the recovery fund, but also through the SURE instrument to finance the spending on labor market policies, labor market support policies. But we're now also spending on an EU level in response to a crisis, which I think is a very different response to the one that we saw to the previous crisis. And I think that is a theme that also comes back when we look at fiscal policy. So very early on in the crisis, the Commission suspended the fiscal rules, and is still a question of when they will come back. And they really create a lot of space this time for governments to respond with fiscal measures to the economic contraction caused by the pandemic. So that's, again, sort of very different to what we saw in previous crises, particularly in the Eurozone crises about a decade ago. And that really allowed the national governments to take this up and to spend and to often put in place measures that were really unthinkable before the pandemic. So think about the labor market support schemes, the furlough schemes that I mentioned, the widespread support for affected sectors, in some cases even nationalizations of certain companies. So these were the kind of measures that really before March of last year, nobody would have expected to see over the last year in the EU. It's not just on fiscal policy. I think that the crisis response was quite novel. It's also when we look at monetary policy, so the way that the European Central Bank responded to the crisis was, I think, very new. The fact that this was the first crisis to which it responded with a large asset purchase program, in contrast to the previous crises, whereas the US and the UK, for instance, did do that with the global financial crisis. Europe didn't start a quantitative easing program, buying government bonds, until 2015, when the bloc wasn't really in a crisis anymore. And now, having expanded this program over the last year, it's planning to buy almost 2 trillion euros worth of bonds, again, creating the fiscal space for governments to do what they feel needs to be done on the fiscal side. So I think that those are quite big shifts in the way that the European political economy operates, at least over the last year. The big question remains, and the one I guess that we're discussing here today, is what this all means going forward. And when we look at, for instance, monetary policy, the question is, will we see that kind of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy that these kind of policies effectively came down to? For instance, will we see that in the green transition, which is something that the European Central Bank has spoken a lot about? And I think that's one of the points that we'll be fighting over the next year or 2 years, given that some in Europe won't be very enthusiastic about that idea, particularly those who prefer a more sort of hard inflation targeting regime, while others are clearly pushing in that direction. On the fiscal rules, I think we'll also see a lot of debate over the coming years, because the Commission has already said that they suggest keeping the rules suspended, at least for 2022 as well. But that does suggest that they would be coming back in 2023. I think before the crisis already, a lot of people had the feeling that the Stability and Growth Pact wasn't quite up to what was needed in terms of fiscal policy in Europe. And so there'll be a big debate over what will the rules look like when they come back, or I think, as some would argue, should they even come back? So I think that's one of the areas in which a lot of debate will still take place. And I think that's really all related to something that we've sort of seen shift over this last year and during the crisis, which is the balance between the state and the market within Europe, with the state taking a much stronger role during the crisis. We've seen quite a lot of ideas floating around already before the pandemic in this regard. A lot of focus on inequality and what sort of states could do to combat that. So I think that those kind of debates will continue to take place within Europe, the question is whether the pandemic will turn out to have been an accelerator of these trends, or whether these were just the necessary measures taken at the high point of a crisis, and whether they can then be reversed, as I'm pretty sure some in Europe would hope would be the case. And I think finally, looking back at the recovery fund, one of the real questions there for the EU, I think, will be whether this becomes a permanent fiscal mechanism within the EU. I think as it is constructed at the moment, that's not the case yet. So it's not yet the fiscal union to complement the monetary union. But it could be built upon to go in that direction. And that's sort of a fight that we'll see over the coming years. And I think a lot of that will be related to what kind of funding will be put in place, or what kind of own resources for the EU will be put in place to pay back the money borrowed under the recovery fund. And I think that's also a question then that we get, that we'll see, whether something like the recovery fund will be able to cope with future crises. And I think at the moment it's something that works because it's been a largely symmetric crisis. Everybody was hit by the pandemic. Some, from an economic perspective, harder than others, but at the end of the day, this was a shared crisis. And I think the instrument as set up at the moment wouldn't really be able to deal with one that hits only a few member states, for instance. So I think there'll be quite a lot to think about in terms of what this means for the entire sort of economic governance framework for the EU, particularly in terms of crises. So I think, that's we've seen quite big shifts in economic thinking and in economic policy making in the EU over the last year. Big question is whether those are going to be either sort of sustained in the way that they've been taking place, or whether they will turn into something different, and we'll see a very big shift in the way that EU economies sort of strike that market-state balance, or whether we'll see a shift going back to the pre-crisis status quo. But I'll leave it there before I throw up even more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pepin. And before we turn to Konstantin, just a very quick follow-up question, because I think indeed, one of the most important issues that you also touched is the next generation EU recovery package, and then the question of whether it becomes a permanent instrument or not. And this is obviously a very sensitive political economic question for a lot of member states. And I would just like to kind of hear from you, if you would see that, do you think that there might be appetite among the member states for a permanent instrument? Because it has, at least kind of from the surface, looked like, even some quite pro-European member states, have had difficulties even accepting the instrument as it is at the moment. So just your kind of 5 cents on that.
So I think for a few, it was very clear that they accepted an instrument like this on the condition that it was temporary. So if you look at the way that the German government effectively sold the instrument in Germany, it was, this is a temporary instrument, this will only happen now. And you see that written into the way that's been set up, in that it's very clear, sort of, this will all be paid back by 2058. So they've set a 30-year period, which is slightly in contrast to what generally happens with government debt, which doesn't really tend to get paid back. It just tends to get rolled over. So I think the question is, what will happen in that regard? And the push will be from several member states, I think, as you rightly sort of point out, to make it temporary. But you might see sort of realities on the ground that you actually becomes really difficult to agree on how do we create the resources to actually pay it back. And do we then not just start rolling it over? And I think there's other incentives to do that as well, in terms of the role of the euro, because you're not only borrowing 500 million to do direct spending in a lot of member states, but you're also creating a safe asset for financial markets denominated in euro. So I think there will be a lot of incentives not actually to pay it back by 2058 and to then sort of morph it into something else. What that will look like, I'm not quite sure yet.
Thank you so much. Konstantin, how do you see that the coronavirus has affected Europe's relationship, like with the United States, and like what has it meant for things like the Europe's place on the world stage and the international balance of power? Because indeed, I mean, it is a very systemic challenge, which has very kind of seems to be having very far-reaching geopolitical consequences as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas, and it's great to be back at the Martin Center, albeit virtually. Let me start by following up on your initial remarks and say that there is no question that we are in the midst of a very grave crisis with no clear end in sight, because we are struggling with the health aspect of the crisis yet still, and the economic aspect is going to follow, and as our previous speaker indicated, it's going to be a very difficult crisis in its own merit. So it seems that the societal and economic consequences of this crisis will prevail for a long period of time. But even now, I mean, it seems that the pandemic crisis, has placed an immense strain on national governments. It has divided our societies, especially in the United States. It has become politicized as an issue. It has exacerbated social inequalities. It has encouraged leaders and governments to act nationally and unilaterally rather than in cooperation. It has demonstrated a weakness of international organizations, and also it has exacerbated tensions between the United States and China, and it has raised questions about the leadership of the United States. Having said all that, I would make the argument that this crisis is not a transformative crisis, in the sense that it is not bringing about sweeping new changes or trends in the world. It is, I would say that it is accelerating pre-existing trends. I would say that it is acting like sort of like a rocket booster of pre-existing trends. And let me focus on 5 aspects of international changes coming to the transatlantic relations in the end. The first, I think, trend is the waning of American leadership. But this is a trend that pre-existed before the crisis. And we see that the United States has not rallied the world in a collective effort to confront either the virus or its economic aspects, its economic effects. And it has not even led the world by example, I mean, by being successful in tackling the crisis at home. So as a result, we've seen many countries in the world that are looking after themselves as best as they can, or they are looking to other great powers. I mean, look at what happened during the first phase of the pandemic. Many countries were looking to China to get medical equipment or ventilators. And look at what is happening in this phase of the pandemic, that some countries look up to Russia to get the Sputnik vaccine because of the lack of enough vaccines coming from the West. So the major question, I think, is whether this is just a result of a faltering American will to provide leadership in the world, or is it due to a more structural process that indicates the loss of competence on the part of the United States, the beginning of some sort of American decay? And I think there is a debate even within the United States about that. Stephen Wald wrote an article about the lack of competence, studying a number of cases over the last 2 decades U.S. foreign policy, but also in U.S. domestic politics and U.S. economic policies, to indicate that the United States has been suffering by a loss of competence as of late. And certainly the federal government's slow, incoherent, ineffective response to the pandemic, I think, reinforced this view that the United States has lost its way, so to speak. Now, with the new administration, things have improved. I mean, the vaccination process has started to roll, but the jury's still out on this verdict. The second aspect, the second trend that pre-existed is it has to do with international cooperation. And I think the crisis indicated that the missing element in this, during this pandemic has been some semblance of a meaningful global response to this crisis. I mean, the near irrelevance of the WHO, the World Health Organization, which should have been central in tackling the pandemic and providing, a concerted response to the pandemic, I think speaks volume about the state of global government. So I think what the pandemic has done is to reveal the gap between the global problems and our capacity to face them in a concerted way. And so we've seen the trends to be reinforced that indicate the resort to national unilateralism. The crisis has reinforced the sort of shrinking of the liberal order and the return to some sort of great power politics, the tragedy of great power politics. Now, the third trend that I see reinforced by this pandemic is the democratic recession, so to speak, that has been evident in recent years. I mean, we all know that democracies are cumbersome political regimes, and in time of crisis, people demand quick fixes. So the protracted nature of this crisis and the inability of our democracies to provide quick solutions, I think that has further eroded the legitimacy of our democratic institutions. And if you couple that with the exacerbation of inequalities as a result of this crisis and the ensuing economic crisis, I think this is not going to help our democracies. Fourth element, the US-Chinese relations. I mean, they have been deteriorating for years, but I think the pandemic has further exacerbated the friction between the two countries. I think in the United States, many hold the Chinese government responsible for its initial denial and cover-up of the pandemic. And China's recent massive PR campaign to portray itself as the new successful model for coping with the pandemic once it put the pandemic under control and use the moment as an opportunity to expand its influence in the world, I mean, it has only increased American hostility. So the old pre-existing tensions have been pushed into the front burner. And by that, I mean all the issues that have to do with trade, with human rights, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. And last, I want to make a point about transatlantic relations. I mean, there is no question that the COVID has done nothing to heal the trauma from Trump's catastrophic attitudes and policies towards Europe. Quite the opposite. I think that it strengthened suspicions and led Europe to a more European response rather than a Western response to the pandemic. Now, the new administration has returned to the old policies. It has returned to the WHO. It has returned to the Paris Agreement for the climate, to the Iranian nuclear deal, and he is sending all the right signals to the European Union. But I think that the suspicion is lingering in the European Union, whether this is back to normal. This signifies a return to normalcy, to business as usual, or whether this return to normalcy will be a parenthesis. And despite the fact that Trump is gone, Trump has remained in the United States, and we are talking about deep structural changes in American society and polity that will affect negatively the state of transatlantic relations in the years to come. So I think these are all questions that we have in front of us. But as a final word, I would say that these trends to one form or another pre-existed, but the pandemic has kind of accelerated and strengthened those trends.
Thank you so much, Konstantin. Like, you raised a number of very, very interesting issues, from the problem of competency in some parts of the US administration, to a crisis of democracy, to questions remaining on like to what extent we can restart the transatlantic relationship. I could ask many questions, but I think I just want to ask one at this stage very quickly, because you spoke about this crisis of democracy, and as you know, President Biden has promised to launch a summit for democracy this year, which intends, among other things, to address like this very specific question, to boost the resilience of democracies around the world and strengthen their ability to also like cope with crises such as the coronavirus one. So how do you see this summit, and do you think that it could potentially address, like, depending on whether it will actually happen or not, this crisis of democracy that you've mentioned?
I think it will happen, but the nature of the discourse regarding democracy has changed, in the sense that we are not talking anymore about the promotion of democracy, the expansion of the liberal order, but the salvation of democracy and the salvation of what has remained of the liberal order. So it's a defensive attitude, and we are talking about the salvation of democracy, and in our own countries. I mean, today the session of Congress was postponed because of threats of another imminent riot by extremist forces against the Capitol. So the threats are not just outside of our democratic systems, but they are from within as well. So I think the attitude has changed. The policy is quite different. It's a defensive policy that has to do with the salvation of our democratic systems and what is left of our liberal order.
Very, very interesting point. But now, like, let's turn to Nadia Kovalchikova to also like move from a related issue, which is the spread of disinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories, like during the coronavirus pandemic. And I think this is quite a natural move, like after we discussed the crisis of democracy, to like move to discussing disinformation. As you know, I mean, there have been a whole bunch of different disinformation, fake news that have been triggered by coronavirus, and we've seen in our social media lots of, let's say, very interesting opinions expressed on the vaccines as well. So Nadia, like, how do you see that the pandemic has like affected disinformation, and then what is Europe's and the transatlantic community's ability to tackle it at the moment?
Thanks, and you're right. This is absolutely linked to the democracy and the challenges that we have also seen exacerbated during the pandemic. And the pandemic and the accompanying infodemic, as the World Health Organization defined the infodemic as the overabundance of information, be it accurate or not, that is making it more difficult for people to filter the correct information in a timely manner from credible sources. And it's quite natural that during the crisis, the times of uncertainty and doubts, people need to have more maybe information than usual. They search for it, they are worried, they're concerned, and therefore the information has really a lot of impact on their ability to follow the guidance, to orientate themselves within the problem and the issues that they are facing, which are kind of new and they're kind of emergent. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the infodemic have really contributed to the spread of this disinformation as well, because crises are also times when some malign actors have an opportunity and take advantage of this situation to create even more chaos and doubts, and they can benefit from that. For example, what we have been seeing, looking at the state actors, that Russia and China have been very active and assertive in the information space. And as it was already mentioned, be it the mask diplomacy or the vaccines, all of the communication and the policies, they are interconnected. And so the way that we communicate about those issues has real impact on people's behavior, people's trust in the governments. And so China and Russia and Iran to a certain extent as well, it depends also in the countries, have used the crisis, exploited it to spread a lot of manipulated information about the origin of the virus, about the way to cure the virus, about the capacity of the EU or NATO or specific countries to address the public health pandemic. And the intention was to undermine the trust in the democratic institutions and processes, but also exacerbate certain divisions between the countries or the institutions and the countries, between the people, different societal groups. So it weakens democracies, and it helps, let's say, the other countries, in this case, for example, China and Russia, to elevate their profiles abroad, but also reflect that profile improvement of the image inside of their countries more domestically. So there are different ways and reasons and benefits from this type of use of tools of manipulated information. And we have seen that these actors particularly have been extremely active. Also, you asked what about the Europe and US, what can they do about it? I mean, this is something that we have been observing for a while. So maybe I would agree here with Konstantin that there have been a lot of exacerbation or acceleration of already existing issues, and disinformation or manipulated information is one of them. And therefore, some tools have been developed at the national level, at the EU level, but most recently, perhaps very important step forward, or good step forward from the EU side, is this European Democracy Action Plan, where one of the three pillars that the action plan focuses on is combating disinformation. There is also the follow-up in the Digital Services Act proposals, where there is another way of looking at the countering disinformation in the sense of the more of an ecosystem of the social media platforms and the digitalization. So in these proposals, an action plan and the policies, initiatives, EU is really not only raising the awareness of how dangerous and how important is to address how dangerous disinformation can be, and how important is to address the spread of manipulated information, not only during the crisis, but think more strategically and beyond. So have certain mechanisms and measures in place that will allow for the countries and the institutions to be more resilient to such manipulated information also in the future. So at the transatlantic level, I think and it's not only transatlantic, but even more international, as the information system is really global at this point, we could say, or interconnected. It's very important that there is a coordination of the measures. For example, when it comes to raising the costs. So on Monday, you also mentioned the European Parliament, Nick, and the committees earlier when we discussed, but there was the meeting of the Special Committee on Foreign Interference and Disinformation in the European Parliament, also with the presence of the EES High Representative Joseph Borrell, where they discussed the importance of the actions from the European side, but also raising the costs to the foreign interference and to disinformation amplification. And so this is very important, because raising the cost, it's much more effective if it's done with partners and allies in a coordinated way. So the malign actors don't do this easily, and there are consequences to exploitation of our information system, of the crisis, of people's fears and concerns. So this is one way I think that EU and US and other allies and partners can really approach more effectively the spread of manipulated information and make the actors that are exploiting the situation have higher costs to do that. So hopefully deter to a certain extent such a behavior. Also, I mentioned the building resilience at the national level, but we also need to continue investing in building resilience at the societal level of people's understanding how this information works, how they can detect it, how they can protect themselves. But I would again agree also with Konstantin that it should not be only responsive all the time. Like we tend to kind of react what the actors do and try to protect and defend our systems, our citizens, our institutions, but we also have to have more proactive approach. And maybe I'll just mention one example because our conversation may continue and go more into details. But one way is really to have much more affirmative and strategic communication plan and implementation at the EU and national level. And what do I mean by that? Is that during the crisis we have seen during the pandemic, bit of a intensification of the European public sphere functioning, which is, I think, one way of how we can counter disinformation. So having more of European voices, authoritative voices that are also present in the national public spheres, and they directly communicate to citizens about the European issues, about the crisis in a way that it matters to the people locally through the channels that they consume regularly, and they have this access because many times there is information vacuum between what is done at the national level, what is done at the EU level or international level, and this information vacuum tends to be exploited by the malign actors, and that's how they use it to create the tensions and drive the wedges. So during the pandemic, this kind of intensification of having President of the Commission Ursula von der Leyen going to speak to Le Monde or other journals, and then Prime Minister of Spain and Italy speaking also to other national media outlets, really showed the way how we can reach wider audiences and people can really understand the challenges the other countries are facing, the EU is facing. They have it communicated accurately and regularly and from direct sources, and they can better orientate themselves. So providing such an international, transnational communication in the ways that matters to people and the matters that matter to them is really helpful to build the resilience of the citizens. So one of the lessons learned that I think would be really great to encourage further bursting those information bubbles and building more of this coordinated European or international public sphere, transnational public sphere.
Excellent points, and just to kind of add very briefly to kind of what you mentioned about the need to have authoritative figures in European politics, like talk also at the national level. I mean, obviously, the leaders have a role to play in this, but would you not also say that even kind of experts, academics like think tankers, like to have a role, and perhaps even a more kind of important one in a way, because they have the ability and perhaps the time to be more visible, like in the discussion of their countries of origin, home countries, however you want to phrase it, than perhaps the highest levels of leaders in Brussels. So just your thoughts on that.
Very good points. I think this is a whole of society effort. So the responsibility, but the action also lies on the other actors, as you mentioned, the civil society or academics, experts, journalists, and also the private sector and representatives, doctors in this case, and the people who experience the challenges of the COVID-19 more directly. So I do think that definitely there are all these actors that do need to contribute and play an important role in communicating the issues to the wider audiences. I think with the leaders, they usually tend to have much more access to media outlets and much more visibility, and also go to the prime times. But there is definitely so much work to be done that anyone who has the interest and the expertise and also the contacts and networks to share their experience and knowledge is absolutely welcome and necessary to coordinate with the other actors. That's a must. So I would say yes, and thanks for raising it. This more holistic and whole society approach is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. I think from this, I'd like to jump into a question to all of you, and which has to do with like resilience that I think all of you have to some extent addressed. Because I think in addition to like being a health crisis, I think the coronavirus pandemic has been a resilience crisis for Europe, and also to the United States and to other countries in the world. And what I mean by that is that, I mean, during the pandemic, we've seen a heightened distrust towards political authorities. We've seen kind of heightened like resistance towards health and safety measures like wearing masks, the confinement. There's not a lot of like trust to what the government is trying to do in some parts of the world. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, disinformation like going around, and sometimes like these frustrations also express themselves in violent form, as we saw this January in the United States. So I would like to hear kind of from all of you of how do you think that in these different policy areas that like you've discussed, what could we do to kind of boost resilience in Europe to ensure that, I mean, we can deal with these sorts of crises and potential other crises in the future more effectively. So, and I'll start with Pepin.
Yes, it's a really interesting question. I think sort of my first thought with that is that yes, we've had quite a lot of pushback and just thinking, also we saw that in the US, sort of the example that you mentioned, but much more recently, there's been a few nights of riots in the Netherlands as well, which followed on from anti-COVID protests. But I think what's been quite remarkable is that has been actually quite limited. And if you look at sort of opinion polls really throughout the crisis, support for the measures being put in place, which were, as we all know, quite sort of restrictive in our freedoms, has been quite high, and this sort of remained high. It's been dipping down a bit now, given that it's just it just keeps on going. But on the whole, the support has been there, and I'm not sure that has been that much of an issue, if I'm really honest. So I think it does relate to the competency point that Constantine also mentioned earlier, and I think there you'll have a difference, like how well our government's responding to this, and you'll see sort of different responses based on that. So I think you boost your resilience in that regard by having the state capacity to actually implement the kind of measures that are needed and to do it well. But on the whole, it's not something that I'm particularly worried about.
Constantine, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I want to focus a little bit on the transatlantic area and how we can better respond to such a crisis. And let's face it, I mean, since if we talk about crises such as the pandemic, I mean, since 1985, we have seen a number of pandemic crises, from AIDS to SARS to Ebola to H1N1 and so on and so to speak. And I think that despite the nationalization of the immediate response to the current crisis, I think that policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic realize that the effective response to such a problem requires more rather than less cooperation. And in that sense, I mean, the response should not be to do away with the WHO or to withdraw from the WHO. The response should be to reform the WHO. So I think that the United States and Europe should work together to reform international organizations such as the World Health Organizations, and also to form a cooperative response to the upcoming challenges, because we're not talking only about pandemics. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about terrorism. We are talking about the challenge of China. These are all challenges that will require the cooperation between the two sides of the Atlantic. So I would say that although, despite the fact that the initial stage and the initial responses have been rather unilateral and nationalistic in nature, I think the nature of these global challenges that we are facing will push towards more cooperation eventually, I hope.
There's a very hopeful note, which I very much appreciate, Konstantin, so thank you. Nadia, what do you think?
I also hope that one of the lessons learned will be more coordination and cooperation between the countries, and that it shows that we see that the EU level, how important it's really to be coordinated on the vaccines and how much strength there is in the alliances, and where we can have big amounts of deliveries and distribution with challenges, and there are challenges. So I do hope you learn from those challenges and that there will be a better, more effective way. I think when we discuss the resilience, building resilience, it starts also from building the trust, and maybe in this sense rebuilding the trust. I think many countries have suffered this decline in trust. In the beginning of the crisis, governments played an important role in mobilization, and there was increase, and there was decrease again. The conspiracy theories and manipulated information undermines the trust, and this will not stop, I don't think, anytime soon. So we really have to make sure that we build the trust not only through the communication tools and having more strategic communications, affirmative narratives, and more European narratives as well, connected with the national ones, but also with the policies. It's not only about healthcare now. It has impact on the foreign policy. There is also impact on the trade. There is impact on the economy overall, climate change. There are so many interconnections that the policies really kind of spill over the effect of the trust of the citizens towards taking other measures and following the guidance of their authorities. So if people trust more, they will also be able to orientate themselves and follow, and maybe we will see less of a polarization in some ways. But I think there is also increased expectation of the responsibility of the democratically elected representatives to be accountable and hold other actors to accountability, hold them accountable when things go wrong. And that has to be, I think, clear to people, transparent, and there have to be mechanisms that allow for progress in our societies and learning from this crisis.
Thank you very much. Another kind of related topic that has gotten a lot of attention, like during this pandemic, is the issue of the security of supply, which has both the economic and then security-related implications. And the European Union, the United States as well, have had to pay a lot more attention to the issue of security of supply, since the beginning of the pandemic than they had before. Especially since at the very beginning they realized that all of a sudden we don't actually have in our own national stockpile sufficient amount of masks, medicines, and other critical equipment that are needed to address a pandemic like that, like the corona one. And now we've seen that this security of supply discussion has broadened a little bit and it has broadened to supply line security in other areas, like producing microchips, etc. And it's become a discussion of autonomy. So my question is, to all of you and whoever kind of wants to take it first, is, do you see that the coronavirus and this, if it kind of ushers in stronger focus on security of supply and kind of, so some would argue that protectionist economic policies, that it could cause a backlash against kind of open trade, what we've had before the pandemic, and we might be entering kind of a new type of era of trade on the world stage. Perhaps I'll start with Konstantin on this one.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Nicholas. And here, especially in the United States, the security of supply became linked to the political discourse with the negative aspect of globalization. And one of the points that Trump made as an excuse of the lack of supplies when it came to masks and ventilators and so on and so forth, that this was another negative aspect of liberals with hyper-globalization, that had taken the manufacturing bases away from America and so on and so forth. That was the first issue. The second issue was that this problem led to a confusion let me use the example of the masks. In the beginning, the administration came out and said, well, masks are not necessarily to deal with the issue of the pandemic. Then later on, they told us that masks are a must so that we can deal with the pandemic. Now they are saying that the double mask is necessary to deal with the pandemic. And that is what has eroded people's trust into government. And in the sense, many people have suspected that this change in narrative has to do with the fact that there was a lack of supplies that led the government to lie in the beginning and then change its narrative in the aftermath. So all these have been linked, have been ingrained into the political discourse in a very negative way. And have a negative impact on the legitimacy of our democratic institutions. People are losing faith in government because the government does not have a consistent narrative when it comes to those issues. And of course, it has been taken. This issue has been used for political purposes from the Trumpists to argue that manufacturing has gone out of the United States due to the previous policies and so on and so forth. So this is, definitely something that we need to look into. There is a talk about safeguarding supplies, creating a supply chain when it comes to these issues, and this is on top of the political discourse here.
Thank you. Pepin, would you have anything to add at this stage?
Yeah, I think it's something that came up quite early in the pandemic. A lot of talk about shifting supply chains, and sort of particularly aimed, of course, at moving them away from a dependence on production in China. I think the challenges to actually achieving that are very large, not just already in the area of sort of PPE and masks and sort of medical supplies. But when you're looking at what the US is now looking at, for instance, shifting semiconductor supply chains as well, like you're talking really significant investment to move that out of, well, in this case, primarily Taiwan. And I think we've already seen that over the last year. Japan is a really good example of this. The Japanese government quite quickly put in place sort of direct financial incentives for Japanese companies to shift supply chains out of China. And they didn't even have to shift them to Japan. They could shift them to anywhere else in Asia as well. And actually, what's been happening since then is that Japanese companies are doubling down on China and on the Chinese market because it's too important for them. So I think that really highlights that there's a very limited amount of control that you have as governments over these kind of processes. So there's a lot of talk. I'm not sure we'll see that much. So then what you need to start thinking about as governments is, how do you create, if you can't create the supply chains for them, how do you create the kind of reserves that you need, which, for instance, Switzerland has done, already did before the pandemic, creating the kind of reserves of medical equipment, for instance, instead of necessarily trying to bring production back home.
Thank you. Natka, you can take the security of supply question, but I have another one that was addressed to you, because you spoke about the spread of disinformation that especially actors like Russia and China have been putting forward. So the question is, given this situation that we're having with Russian and Chinese disinformation, what could Europe do to kind of strengthen its own position and speak more effectively and act in a more unified manner when it comes to dealing with Russian and Chinese disinformation? Because, as you know, I mean, Europe has a way of dealing with these, but I mean, it could be more effective and more unified still.
Yes, of course, and both questions are interesting. I'll start then with this one that came in. I think the EU, it was also discussed in this special committee, needs to raise the costs higher on this type of tools of interference in our democracies by other countries, be it Russia or China. At the moment, at the institutional level, there have been already increased resources, be it human or financial, to monitor and analyze the interference by Russia, but there is really not mandate for China, and so that needs to be adapted. There needs to be more of this exposure of other actors' activities as well. There have to be resources invested into the tools and the teams and the mechanisms to monitor that, and then make it raise awareness about it and have the evidence-based conversation on that. I'd like to just connect it. It comes to the supply chain, but also to this. The public health crisis that we are currently experiencing, it should not be the partisan contest. And so it's not only about the other actors, it's also in general, the exploitation of the crisis. It really should not be a partisan contest. It should be much more evidence and fact-based conversations. And I think there is a lot of potential to also boost and support journalism, investigative journalism, independent journalism, and make sure that there is enough resources to track stories in a longer term, and it's not only reaction in the newsy manner to something that comes up and immediately react, but have these resources to go deeper into the issues and investigate on issues and then expose it to the public. So I think the EU has a role, also the countries have the role to do this, to use more of these mechanisms and coordinate also in the education sector to increase the media literacy, digital literacy of the people. That comes back to the more of a even bottom up, I would say. But it's critical that we don't see these issues in isolation. Spread of disinformation is not only about talking about this spreading this one narrative. It's a coordinated, deliberative effort to undermine democracies, and there are other tools used in parallel to do that. So, for example, we are looking at cyber attacks or the malign finance or economic coercion, as was mentioned, potentially as well, and subversion of civil society. So I think it's very important to keep this holistic view and understand that these tools are not used in silos. They're not meant to be used in silos, and are kind of leveraged in combination also with other tools. So having that holistic understanding will really help to address those threats better.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of the time, and I know that our speakers have other engagements. I mean, immediately after this, I would have a lot of questions that I could still ask, but unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to dig any deeper this time. I think I can just, I just want to say that I think this has been a very, very interesting discussion. And some of the takeaways, I think we heard today that, I mean, first of all, the coronavirus pandemic, it has been and continues to be a systemic challenge at a global level. It has been, for Europe, I mean, it has caused dramatic change in its economic policy, as most visibly like through the Next Generation EU recovery package that we'll definitely hear about also this year and going forward, especially with regards to will it be permanent or not, and how different member states will position themselves to it. We've also seen that the coronavirus pandemic has changed things, the relationships between great powers. It has increased tensions between the United States, China, and also like allowed Russia and China especially to use vaccine diplomacy to boost their influence. And we've also seen that, I mean, it has decreased to some extent the resilience of countries across on both sides of the Atlantic, and that it has kind of facilitated the spread of disinformation and created new markets and for different types of disinformation that we perhaps didn't expect to see before. But to end on a more hopeful note, I mean, even though, I mean, it is and continues to be a crisis, we've heard today that there are ways in which we can address the pandemic. our democratic societies are under strain, but there is a willingness to defend them. There's a willingness to safeguard them, and going forward, it's very also encouraging to hear from the current U.S. administration that there is a strong willingness and effort then to take care and defend these common values and systems. So thank you very much to all of our speakers today. I'm very pleased that all of you could join, and please have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.